Claire arrived at Jack Harper's ranch with nothing but a worn coat, a road-weary stare, and a single coin to her name. All because a powerful ranch owner swore she'd never have a safe home again. That man's reach stretched far, and his cruelty was as calculated as it was cold, leaving her no place to turn. But that night, fate put her on the porch of a cowboy who still knew the meaning of honor, and who had his own way of setting things right. And just wait until you hear the turn this story takes, and how justice, at last, found its way back to the desert. The evening in the border town had that peculiar kind of stillness that wasn't peace so much as a pause before something happened. The sun had long slipped behind the low hills, leaving only a dim, coppery glow along the horizon, and the wind carried the dry scent of mesquite and dust. Jack Harper sat on the front porch of his small ranch house, the boards beneath him worn smooth from years of boots and weather. He moved with the slow, methodical rhythm of a man who had no reason to rush, filling his old briar pipe the way he'd done every night for the last 20 years, tamping the tobacco with the flat of his thumb, striking a match, watching the flame dance before drawing in the first curl of smoke. Somewhere out past the river, thunder rolled, long and low like distant hoofbeats, and the air felt heavy, restless. The wind shifted, sending thin fingers of grit swirling across the yard and rattling the dry leaves of the cottonwoods by the fence. The road stretching past his place was empty, a pale scar of dust fading into the shadows, and he was just about to call it a night, to step inside and let the lantern light take over from the dying day. His hand was already on the door handle when something caught his eye, a shape moving slow along the edge of the lamplight, far enough away that it seemed part of the dark until it stepped closer. Jack's gaze narrowed. The figure was small, wrapped in a long, weather-beaten coat, shoulders slightly hunched against the wind. A wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, hiding most of the face, but he could see the steady way she walked, like she'd been at it for miles, and wasn't about to stop unless she had to. When she reached the gate, she paused, one hand resting lightly on the worn wood, and lifted her head just enough for the kerosene lamp's glow to catch a hint of her eyes. Her voice was quiet, carried more by resolve than strength. "I have only one coin, for shelter until morning." Jack let out a short, humorless laugh, a single breath through his nose that carried no warmth. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and even, "one coin won't buy you so much as a cup of coffee in these parts. Certainly not a night under a roof." She didn't flinch, didn't look away. If anything, her chin rose a fraction, the set of her shoulders tightening as though she'd expected that answer and didn't much care for it. There was no trace of pleading in her tone when she spoke again. Just a quiet steadiness, the kind that made a man think twice. Jack studied her for a long moment. The lamplight threw her shadow long across the yard, the lines of her frame telling him she'd been living lean for a while. Something in her presence tugged at a place in him he preferred to keep closed off. He spat into the dust, the sound sharp in the stillness, and gave a short nod toward the porch. "All right, step inside. But when the sun's up, we go our separate ways." He told himself it was nothing more than a small kindness for a stranger who'd probably be gone before breakfast. In his mind, she was just another drifter beaten down by too many miles and too few good breaks. But as the first cool drops of rain began to patter against the roof and the thunder grew closer, Jack Harper had no way of knowing that this single choice would unravel that neat certainty before the night was through. Inside, the air held the quiet warmth of a place lived in for years without much change. It smelled of wood smoke, leather worn smooth by time, and the faint trace of dust that no amount of sweeping could quite banish on the frontier. The light was soft, coming from a single lantern on the mantel and the steady glow of the fire in the iron stove. Jack Harper moved with the practiced ease of a man who'd worked this routine into his bones. He knelt, tossed a couple of split logs onto the embers, and listened as they caught with a soft crackle. The orange light brightened, casting shifting shadows along the plank walls, and he straightened, stepping toward the old tin coffee pot sitting on the stove's edge. The woman set her coin down on the table as if it were a matter of honor, though Jack had already decided he wasn't going to take it. She removed her coat carefully, almost reluctantly, as though it was a barrier between her and the room. Beneath it, she wore a plain, travel-worn shirt tucked into faded trousers, the kind that had seen dust from more than one state line. Her boots were scuffed and cracked, each crease telling of miles walked without complaint. She held herself with a kind of understated dignity, despite the wear on her clothes, like someone who knew that appearance mattered less than endurance out here. Jack poured the coffee into a chipped enamel mug and slid it across the table toward her. Steam rose between them, carrying the bitter scent of strong beans boiled the cowboy way. She wrapped her hands around it without a word, letting the heat soak into her fingers. "Traveling far?" he asked, pouring his own and lowering himself into the opposite chair. She didn't answer right away. Her gaze had gone to the flames dancing behind the stove's grate, and he could see the reflection of the fire in her eyes that looked like they'd known more night than daylight. Finally she spoke, her voice low but steady, far enough not to look back. Jack studied her over the rim of his mug. He'd seen that look before, in men riding out of towns they'd never dare return to, and in women walking away from places that had taken too much from them. It wasn't just distance she was chasing, it was something behind her she didn't want catching up. He set a plate of beans and cornbread on the table, watching as she picked up the fork. She ate slowly, not from hesitation but from a deliberate savoring, as if each bite might be the last decent meal she'd have in a while. Jack knew what that meant. He'd been there himself, eating slow to stretch the comfort of the moment before the road called again. After a while, he rose, muttering something about checking the horses before the weather turned worse. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the barn door, and he took a few minutes to make sure his mare had fresh water and the stalls were secure. When he came back in, brushing dust from his coat, the room was quieter than before. She had moved from the table to the worn armchair near the fireplace. The coffee mug sat empty on the small stand beside her, and she was curled into the chair, her head tilted back against the high leather backrest. The firelight painted her face in soft gold and shadow, making her look younger and older at the same time. In her right hand, still resting in her lap, she clutched the single coin she had offered him at the gate, as if it were not payment, but something she could not bear to set aside. Jack stopped in the doorway and watched her for a long moment. There was a stillness about her now that wasn't the stillness of weariness. It was something harder to name. She seemed like a soul caught between storms, too light to sink and too stubborn to be blown away. And in that quiet moment, Jack realized she wasn't like the other drifters who came through this country, gone with the first strong wind or tempted away by the next promise down the trail. Something in her presence anchored her to the room, as though the walls themselves had decided she belonged there, at least for this night. And though he'd told her they'd part ways come morning, Jack Harper felt the first pull of doubt about letting her walk back out into that wind dot. The storm drummed a steady, hollow music against the shutters, a rhythm that slipped into Jack's sleep and pulled him up fast, the way long years on the range had taught him to wake at the smallest wrong sound. The door hinges gave a thin groan, metal on wood, cautious and guilty, and he was already on his feet, hand reaching for the rifle by habit more than intent, breath held as if the room itself might be listening. He stepped into the glow from the stove and saw her silhouette in the doorway, the lamplight outlining the brim of her hat and the slope of her shoulders. Claire was moving quiet toward the porch, as if hoping to leave without stirring the air. Wind pushed at the door, tugging at her coat hem, carrying the smell of wet dust and the sharp bite of rain. "You reckon I'm letting you walk out into that wind at this hour?" Jack's voice came harsher than he meant, barked over the storm's racket, the edge born from worry disguised as temper. She stopped with one boot over the threshold, fingers tightening around the hat, like it was the only sure thing she owned. "I won't be a burden, Mr. Harper," she said, turning just enough for him to catch the calm in her face. "You've done more than enough." His jaw worked, the old stubbornness rising, then settling as he studied the resolve in her eyes. "Sit," he said softer, nodding toward the chair by the stove. She hesitated, stepped back in, and the door thudded shut behind her, the shutters rattling like dice in a cup. For a long moment only the fire spoke, throwing slow light over the room, painting the scars on the table, the cracks in the floor, the quiet patience of a life lived plain. When she finally spoke, her words came measured, each one placed like a footstep on a narrow ledge. She told him about Arizona, about miles of fence line and a big spread with a name everyone knew, even the lawmen 2 counties over. She didn't dress it up, didn't linger on detail. She just laid it out clean, the way truth demands. Her husband, a man whose handshake could open doors and close them for others, had a way of making sure his wishes drifted wherever he wanted them. There were no raised voices in her telling, only the weight of what it feels like to be measured and found convenient, then reminded you own nothing that can't be taken. "He told me I'd never again have a house I could call safe," she said, eyes steady on the fire. Said he'd make sure of it. She didn't repeat the threat as a boast or a plea. She delivered it like a weather report. A storm sat on the ridge and was coming down, and she'd chosen to move ahead of it. The coin, she unfolded her hand and there it lay, dull in the stove's glow, was from her mother. The last piece of a small box that had once held trinkets and a paper scrap with a pressed blue flower. The rest was gone to time and travel. Only the coin remained, and she kept it close not for its worth, but for what it named within her. The right to cross a threshold and be welcomed. The idea of a room where the night had no claim. Jack listened without interrupting, the rifle forgotten against the wall. The first feeling he'd carried at the gate, hard judgment born of too many drifters and too many stories with a price, dissolved under the plain shape of her account. He knew men like the one she described, the kind who didn't need to raise a hand to make a point because their shadow did the work. The room seemed to draw tighter around them, as if the house itself were holding its breath. He noticed small things, the way her thumb traced the coin's edge when she paused, the way she kept her voice level out of respect for his quiet rather than fear of it, the way exhaustion clung to her but didn't bend her spine. Outside, the storm pressed its palm against the windows, but the stove heat stood firm, laying a band of comfort between the wind and the two of them. Jack realized there was a line he had carried all evening between offering shelter and keeping distance, and it had been wiped clean by the simple clarity of her story. The contempt that had once seemed sensible curled up and went still. In its place rose respect, not the loud kind, but the steady kind that sets a man's shoulders square. Alongside it came a slow, controlled anger. Anger at a world that lets influence pass for fairness, at a promise meant to unsettle a person's claim to a roof and a name on a door. He didn't say any of that out loud. He just set the rifle properly back on its pegs, dragged the extra blanket from the chest to the foot of the chair, and nodded once, a promise without flourish. "No one's a burden who asks with a straight look," he said. "The wind can do without you tonight." She breathed out, barely a sound, and the tension in her hands eased as she tucked the coin back into her palm. The shutters took another push from the storm, but inside the room, something else settled. A plain, unspoken agreement that until morning, the house would be hers as much as his, and that the fear meant to follow her would stay on the other side of... The dawn came slow over the desert, the first light spilling across the horizon like molten gold. The mesas caught the glow before anything else, their edges sharp against the pale sky, while the open flats shimmered with the promise of heat yet to come. The storm from the night before had left the air washed clean, and the sense of damp earth and mesquite drifted faintly through the open window. Inside the small ranch house, the warmth now came from the stove, where Jack Harper stood at the skillet, turning strips of bacon with a practiced hand. The sizzle was the only sound for a long while, steady and unhurried. Claire sat at the table, her hat resting on the chair beside her, fingers loosely clasped in her lap. She watched the steam curling from the coffee mug in front of her, but her eyes kept flicking toward him as if she was waiting for the words that would send her back onto the road. The quiet between them wasn't tense, but it held the weight of a moment that could tilt either way. Jack slid a plate in front of her, the bacon crisp and the eggs still steaming. He rested a hand on the back of the chair, his gaze meeting hers. "If you want," he said, the words even and deliberate, "you can stay. Not for that coin, for yourself." For a second she didn't move, as if testing whether she'd heard him right. Then her head lifted, and in the morning light he saw something in her face he hadn't seen all night. Not just relief, but the faint, steady spark of hope. It was the kind that doesn't flare up suddenly, but takes root quietly, waiting for the right place to grow. Jack reached for the small coin she had carried so tightly, the one she'd placed on his table the night before. He turned it over once in his fingers, feeling the worn ridges, and then set it on the mantel above the fire. "Let it stay here," he said. "A reminder. You don't owe a thing here." She looked at the coin as though seeing it in a different way, no longer a bargaining chip, but a marker of a road behind her. The firelight caught on its edge, and for a moment it seemed brighter than it had any right to be. Outside, the sun was climbing, painting the desert floor in long shadows and sharp light. Jack knew the West had its own way of measuring worth. Gold, land, head of cattle, and in most men's eyes those were the only things that counted. But as he watched Claire sit a little straighter, the tightness in her shoulders easing, he understood that this time, value was measured in something no bank or assay office could weigh. The treasure in his home that morning wasn't metal or land. It was a person who had walked through the kind of storm that strips a soul down to its bones, and still had the will to keep her eyes on the horizon. And Jack Harper, a man who thought he'd seen every sort of traveler the desert could send his way, found himself hoping that horizon would always be one they could share.